Triangle is one of the strangest and most underrated horror movies of the 2000s. And part of what makes it so effective is how it keeps changing shape right in front of your eyes. At first, it feels almost straightforward. A group of friends head out on a yacht, storm rolls in, boat overturns, they climb on board an eerie ghost liner that appears out of nowhere, and people start dying. For a while, the film plays like a slasher at sea. There's a hidden assailant, a sense of stalking, strange noises in empty corridors, bodies turning up, and one central question hanging over everything: who's doing this? Then the floor drops out because the moment that Jess looks out and sees the capsized yacht again with another set of survivors approaching the ship, the movie stops being just a survival horror story, it becomes something much stranger. It becomes a sort of cosmic logic puzzle. Not cosmic horror in the sense of giant monsters or tentacled gods, but cosmic horror in the sense that reality itself can no longer be trusted. It's no longer stable. Time folds, events recur, causality becomes optional, and the film suddenly starts asking a much different question than it started out asking. Not just who's killing these people, but what kind of world are we in? And that's why Triangle endures. Now, there are a few ways to interpret the structure, but the most consistent and easiest to track is that there's two repeating loop types: loop A and loop B. They're not identical, they rhyme. And the differences explain any apparent contradictions or paradoxes that only appear if you assume that it's a single loop. Now, the big idea here is that in one loop type, Jess remains confused for longer and endures the burlap sack attacker as a mystery first. The other loop type just becomes aware earlier and is forced to act aggressively earlier on. That early information changes her behavior, and that behavior is the difference that ripples forward. So you end up with two versions of the same overall cycle that alternate with each other. Now, it's a movie with enough structure to reward close attention, but enough dream logic to resist being fully pinned down. You can sketch a map of what's happening, at least broadly, but the film never becomes just any diagram. It keeps a nightmarish quality to it. It keeps you wondering whether the logic that you are seeing is real or whether the whole thing is some kind of shattered internal landscape in Jess's mind. Let's start off by looking at the core pattern of events on the ship, because once you see the pattern, the rest of the film opens up. So, from the ship's point of view, the basic sequence of events: the yacht arrives with the survivors. They board the ocean liner, the Aeolus. Strange things begin happening almost immediately. There are signs that they're not alone. There's hints that this place has already been lived in. People begin dying on a broad recurring order. Victor goes down first, then Greg, then Downey, then Sally. Jess becomes the last central figure, still moving through the ship's corridors, still trying to make heads or tails of what's happening, still trying to stop it. And the cycle, broadly speaking, ends when Jess is thrown into the sea. That's the skeleton. The yacht arrives, group boards, the deaths unfold, Jess remains, Jess goes overboard, wash, rinse, repeat. Once you have that much, the film becomes a bit easier to follow, because what Triangle is doing is not simply repeating one clean loop over and over again, like Groundhog Day or Happy Death Day or something like that. It's actually layering loops on top of each other. Before one cycle has fully finished, another one's already begun. That's why the movie feels so disorienting, and I think it's one of its strongest moves. At any given moment, there can be multiple versions of Jess, multiple versions of the same situation, all coexisting on the ship at the same time. That's where the two loop model becomes helpful, not because it solves everything, because it definitely doesn't, but because it gives you at least a working structure to be able to plot what's happening. The basic idea is that there's two main recurring patterns, two alternating versions of the loop. This basic structure allows us to differentiate what's happening in that particular loop, because like I said, Jess encounters the burlap sack figure and then later becomes the figure herself, trying to control events by shooting the others. In the other pattern, Jess becomes even more vicious, deceptive, and desperate, turning to stabbing and manipulation. The broad structure remains, but the details vary, and that variation matters, because it means that the movie is not just showing us the same thing over and over again. It's showing us a nightmare system that mutates within fixed boundaries. The deaths recur, the ship recurs, the arrivals recur, but the inner emotional texture changes. Jess is not always in exactly the same mental or moral position. Sometimes she's confused. Other times she's panicked. Sometimes she's trying to save everybody, and sometimes she's convinced herself that the only way out is to kill everyone first. That's why the film feels grounded and dreamlike at the same time. Grounded because there is a core sequence that you can trace, even if the individual details are different. Dreamlike because the more you trace it, the more it slips from clean realism. And I think that tension is exactly the point, because Triangle wants to be precise enough that you can sense a pattern, but unstable enough that pattern itself becomes horrifying. The logic isn't comforting. It only reveals that Jess is trapped inside of something bigger, older, and more hostile than she can understand. That's also why the title works on multiple levels. On the surface, there's the maritime mystery angle, right? The title triangle naturally invokes Bermuda Triangle, that old idea of a cursed region at sea where ships vanish, instruments fail, and ordinary reality seems to break down. The storm, the ocean liner appearing from out of nowhere, the eerie sense of displacement, all of that invites that reading early on. Before the deeper mythic and psychological material comes into focus, the film already feels like a mix between a ghost ship story passing through a Bermuda Triangle kind of anomaly and a slasher flick set in a place where space and time are folding in on itself. That's the surface layer, and it is very effective. But the deeper you go, the more the movie starts to look less like a maritime mystery and more like a Greek myth being played out in front of your eyes. The ocean liner is called the Aeolus. That's not subtle. Aeolus in Greek mythology is the keeper of the winds and the father of Sisyphus. And once that connection clicks, Triangle starts to reveal itself as a modern Greek tragedy. Because what is Jess doing in the film? Really, what's happening here? She's repeating a doomed labor. She's caught in a cycle of striving and failing and beginning again. She believes each time, in some form or another, that maybe now she can fix it. Maybe now she can save the others. Maybe now she can get back to her son. Maybe now she can break the pattern. But every attempt only feeds the cycle. That's pure modern Sisyphus. Not just repetition, but repetition fueled by the hope that this time the effort will finally matter. The stone goes up the hill, the stone rolls back down, and because it might go over the top the next time, the labor continues. That is Jess. And the film makes this even more explicit through the story's larger frame. See, once Jess is thrown into the sea, the movie takes us back to land. And there, the tragic architecture comes into view. She goes home. She sees another version of herself, one that's harsh, abusive, exhaustive, and very cruel towards her son. She straight up kills that version with a hammer. She tries to take her place. She gets into the car with her kid. They're trying to escape. There's a crash. And then there's a taxi driver that offers her a ride. And then, impossibly or symbolically, she's back on the yacht again, heading toward the same storm, the same ship, the same cycle. Each one giving a different point of view on an earlier scene that you saw, giving you a deeper understanding of just how interconnected this whole thing is and how hopeless escape truly is. Now, this is where the film opens itself to multiple interpretations, and I think it's important not to flatten it because the director clearly leaves room for the movie to function on more than one level. You can track the loops. You can build a model. You can get a basic map of the ship's recurring events. But Triangle is not only interested in being a puzzle box, it's also interested in what the loop means. So, what are the major readings for the loop? One's grief. On this reading, the film is about the refusal to accept loss, right? Jess dies in the car crash alongside her son. And instead of moving on, she enters a repetitive state of denial, endlessly returning to the beginning because some part of her cannot let go. The taxi driver becomes crucial here. He's like a ferryman, like a version of Charon, a mythic guide of the dead. Jess is given a chance, perhaps to move on, to cross over, to accept what's happened. Instead, she says yes to the ride back to the harbor. She chooses repetition. She chooses the impossible hope that maybe the day can still come, that everything will be repaired and go back to normal. That is a powerful grief read because grief so often feels repetitive, circular. One thought leads back to the same image, the same regret, the same if only. If only I had done that differently. If only I had said that or didn't say that. If only I had one more day. Triangle takes that emotional reality and literalizes it as a time loop. Another reading is mental fragmentation, even mental illness. This works because the film is saturated with doubles, gaps in memory, contradictory behavior, and even unstable selfhood. Jess isn't merely trapped with other people. She's trapped with versions of herself, some that are frightened, some calculating, some violent, some maternal, and some monstrous. That opens the door to a psychological reading in which the ship becomes less of a literal supernatural loop and more of a fractured inner world. Jess is split against herself. She's simultaneously the loving mother that she wants to be and the impatient, bitter, harmful mother she has in fact become. The overlapping Jesses become expressions of guilt, denial, repression, and even self-hatred. I do not think the film has to be only in her head for that reading to matter. In fact, I think it's stronger if it's not. The movie works because The psychological and the supernatural mirror each other. The outer nightmare and the inner nightmare are the same shape. Then there's the purgatory read, or perhaps more accurately, the afterlife read. Many people describe the film as purgatorial because Jess is clearly dead or death adjacent by the time the loop fully reveals itself, and she's trapped in a process that seems linked to moral failure. But I'm not sure purgatory is the right word. If by purgatory you mean a cleansing process with the possibility of a real release. See, Triangle doesn't feel medicinal. It doesn't feel like sanctification. It feels more punitive. It feels static. The loop doesn't seem to be purifying Jess. It only makes her more desperate, more violent, more entangled within it. If anything, the movie feels closer to a vision of torment. Not hell in a fire and brimstone sense, but hell in a more mythic, repetitive without resolution sense. Hell as the impossibility of ever finally undoing what has been done. That's where the religious symbolism becomes quietly potent in this movie. Just as a woman trying to atone for sin through repetition and effort. She tries to fix the world by sheer force of will, by doing it over, by controlling the next sequence better than the last. But she can't redeem herself. She can't raise the dead. She cannot undo the accident. She can't escape by becoming more violent, more determined, or more clever. The film offers no clear path of grace. And that absence is probably the most haunting part, because the more she labors, the more obvious it becomes that the labor itself just simply is not enough. That is one of the reasons that the Greek myth reading feels so strong. It contains all of these others, at least in parts. The grief is there, the fractured psyche is there, the afterlife structure is there. But the Greek tragedy frame gives the film its deepest emotional shape. Jess is not simply in a time loop, she's in a sentence. She is in a world where repetition itself has become a form of punishment. The sea matters enormously here. Ancient thought often treats the sea as a place of chaos, instability, and the undoing of order. Land is structure, home, settlement, place. The sea is flux. The sea erodes. The sea returns and returns and returns. In Triangle, time behaves like the sea. It does not move cleanly. It churns, it folds back, it throws Jess against the same rocks over and over again. Even the ship itself feels like a less like a realistic location than a liminal space, a vessel suspended between life and death, memory and punishment, reality and dream. That's why the ship's details feel so uncanny. The stopped clock, the decaying food, the piles of bodies, the repeated objects, the music that sounds like a lullaby curdled into a nightmare song. The film is full of little signs that this is not an ordinary space. This is time gone rotten. And yet, importantly, the film never lets itself become only abstract. That's what keeps it tragic. Because at the center of all of the mechanics and symbolism is still a mother and a child. Jess wants to return to Tommy. She wants to believe that there is still a version of herself that can be kind, protective, and good. Even when she says, in effect, that the other woman was not really his mother, that she is the real mother. You can hear the desperation in her voice. She's trying to split herself in two so that one self can be condemned and the other one can be saved. But the film doesn't allow that split to hold. Jess is both. That is the tragedy. She is the woman that loves her son, and she's the woman who has failed him. She's the victim and the perpetrator. She's the frightened survivor and the burlap sack killer. She's the self that wants to repair and the self that keeps making things worse. And that's why Triangle lingers. It's not just intellectually clever. It's morally and emotionally ugly in a way that feels real, not realistic in a literal sense, but perhaps real in a way that regret feels real. Real in a way that guilt can trap a person in recursive thought. Real in a way that grief and shame can make time itself feel poisoned. By the end, I do not think that the film offers a whole lot of hope on its own terms. That may sound harsh, but I think it's honest. The pelicans by the roadside suggest repetition on a scale that's almost unbearable if you think about it. Not a handful of cycles, not a bad day that can finally be solved. Something vast, something ancient, something that has happened so many times that counting just becomes meaningless. And yet the film does something interesting with all of that bleakness. It provokes longing. Because even though the movie itself offers no redemption, it makes you feel the absence of redemption very sharply. It makes you want a break in the cycle. It makes you want forgiveness to be possible. It makes you want some voice from beyond the loop to intervene and say, okay, this can end. You've been through enough. This does not have to go on forever. But Triangle itself doesn't say that. It leaves Jess in the storm. And that's what makes this such an effective tragedy. It does not reassure, it does not resolve cleanly. It does not tell you which reading cancels the other ones out. It lets the mechanics matter, but it refuses to become only mechanics. It lets the symbolism deepen the story, but it refuses to become merely an allegory. It is a slasher at sea that mutates into a cosmic horror puzzle, then deepens into a grief story, then darkens into a myth of punishment and redemption. So, what is Triangle? It's a ghost ship movie. It's a Bermuda Triangle style maritime anomaly. It's a time loop puzzle. It's a portrait of fractured motherhood. It's a nightmare of grief and denial. It's a purgatorial or infernal afterlife. And maybe, most clearly of all, it's a modern Greek tragedy about a woman condemned to push the stone uphill forever. That's a lot for one small cult horror film to carry. And somehow it manages it. Because beneath all the cleverness, Triangle understands something very old and very painful, that there are some acts that we cannot undo, some losses that we cannot reverse, and some versions of ourselves that we cannot completely separate from who we wish we had been. Just keeps trying anyway. And that's what makes her tragic. She's not simply trapped by time, she's trapped by the hope that time can still be made to yield a different result. And that's why Triangle remains one of the eeriest and most quietly devastating horror films of its era. Not because it's hard to understand, but because once you understand the core of it, even a little, it becomes much harder to escape.